about human nature, right? I have this person, Tony Dumont, who has this great line that I really believe in. And Tony says, humanity never fails to disappoint. Right? Never fails, right? So what's going to wind up happening with these things? The potential, and I can't say it's going to happen, with definite, assurances. But if you look at human nature being what human nature is, you're going to wind up with people that are going to look at this and go, wow, if I could steal this, I could set up the black market. Because think about it. Who really wants to be the last person to get this? Everybody wants to be first, right? And we'll get into what how you establish who the essential personnel is that's supposed to get this, right? But you look at human nature being what it is, and people are going to go out, they'll steal it, and then what they'll do is they'll go out and establish a black market to it and say, listen, we have a supply of it, we can give you a shot, we'll take care of you, and we'll charge you $5,000 or whatever.
Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I am Jim Henry, here with my good friend, co-host, and guest for today's show, Sal Lafreri. Before we begin, I would like to remind each of you to subscribe to this show and push the like button for us. Please leave comments as to your opinion is important to us. Today's topic: now that the COVID vaccine is here, but what risks are associated with and lurk with it? So the reason that Sal has something to contribute here, and I guess the 20 years since you have been in the private sector from your career at NYPD, we've had a number of threats that you've prepared for. We had the SARS threat, we had the anthrax threat, whatnot. The planning that you had for the distribution and application of either the anecdotes or the policies and procedures to try and deal with that threat. What similarities exist between that and COVID?
I can only imagine that those sitting around the table trying to figure out how they're going to get the distribution of the vaccine done, that they're probably getting about 2 or 3 concussions a day from just banging their head into the wall. It's just, when I was with the city, we had, part of what we were doing was writing the continuity of operations plan and looking at what the city would do for chemical and biological terrorism. And anthrax was obviously the big thing at the time that we were trying to plan for. And so we were looking at, how do you actually, you got a solution, right? Which is very similar to what we got today. We got a solution, you got a vaccine, and now you have to get it distributed to everyone. And you start going through the logistics of it, and you get into the weeds with it. And it is just unbelievable, the amount of problems that you get. And I find it funny because today everybody's all excited about the fact that we got a vaccine, and we should be happy that we got a vaccine in record time, that we have something that, we strongly believe is going to be a defender to deal with the COVID. But you just kind of look at this and I realize that, man, we're not at the end of this. We're barely at the middle of this because there is just so many things that can go wrong and issues that have to pop up that the public just doesn't really recognize at this point.
So even with Operation Warp Speed and with manufacturing these in anticipation of getting approval, the distribution is going to be a lot faster than it otherwise would have been. But even with that, it's going to take time to get out to the healthcare workers first, the first responders, the aged and infirmed, and, before it gets to the rank and file. So does the value of the vaccine, barring, God forbid we have any kind of allergic reactions of any consequence here, and it really seems to be doing its job, does the value of the vaccine then make it a target for those that don't want to wait their turn?
Those that don't want to wait to turn, those that are mentally challenged to be politically correct, the terrorist opportunities that exist with it. When you're looking at something like this, you recognize the value that it has, and you realize that there are, of the people that want it, right, placing a very high value on it. They think it's great. They want it. They're willing to take it. You have the other pools of people that maybe are somewhat reluctant, and you have the others that don't want it. But the ones that want it, we're looking at something that has an incredible high value to it. And the value is not just necessarily in the dollars and cents, but it's also in the ability to, for health, right? There's the thing that you just can't put the value on. You can't put a dollar figure on what it means to somebody to be able to survive in COVID and to be able to continue a productive life. So you have the intrinsic value, but more importantly, you have the overall value of it. And that makes it an incredible target, because now you have someone that can sit there and say, if we can effectively attack the distribution of this, we can stop a lot of people from, and again, now comes into motivation. Are they motivated to? Are they looking at it to prevent people from being injured? There's a contingent of people out there, and to be politically correct, we'll say, with psychological, disabilities that, potentially feel that by getting the vaccine is going to be detrimental to society, and think that they're doing the right thing by stopping it and trying to attack the distribution part of it. And then you have the others that would be looking at it and saying, you know what? We love the fact that everybody is wrapped around the axle. We love the fact that the economy is being hit incredibly hard. You look at some of the motivations from the terrorist organizations, and, bin Laden was great about that, right? Bin Laden's comment was always, don't worry so much about a body count. Worry about hitting them economically, right? That's where you're going to have the most long-term effect. So, cause, economic disruption. And it makes it when you start looking at it in that perspective, it makes it a target. Will anybody really want to take a look at this? No. I mean, right now, the general population's looking at this. Thank God we finally got the vaccine, and it's going to come and it's going to save us. But, as I joke about all the time, I'm not a glass half full or half empty guy. I'm just a guy waiting for the can to get kicked over. And these are issues that we run into.
So we're going to be dealing with the safety and security of the vaccine, and as we discussed on an earlier show, about the requirements, mandates to take the vaccine by employers. The biggest pressure to take is really going to be peer pressure. If you want to navigate society, you're going to have to be one of the ones that have been vaccinated. But you're going to the momentum to keep everybody on board for doing that is going to be continued trust that the early results we've seen from the trials of 95% efficacy, we realize in actual vaccinations. So it certainly would threaten that trust if there was fake vaccines being distributed out there, right? And so let alone the risk of not maintaining for the Pfizer vaccine, this very stringent temperature requirement. So not only for the real vaccine, do you need to make sure that the chain of custody of storage and transportation is maintained at that level for it to maintain its efficacy. You also have to worry about fake vaccines, being distributed. And of course, if people are taking them and still getting sick, then people are going to wonder, well, is the vaccine really as good as what those trials said? Maybe this isn't what it's up against. So the challenge for the safety and security to protect, these vaccines, to ensure that the numbers that we got in the trials are the numbers that we get, in reality, are going to be really important, especially on the front end.
Think about human nature, right? I have this person, Tony Dumont, who has this great line that I really believe in. And Tony says, humanity never fails to disappoint. Right? Never fails, right? So what's going to wind up happening with these things? The potential, and I can't say it's going to happen, with definite, assurances. But if you look at human nature, being what human nature is, you're going to wind up with people that are going to look at this and go, wow, if I could steal this, I could set up the black market. Because think about it. Who really wants to be the last person to get this? Everybody wants to be first, right? And we'll get into what, how you establish who the essential personnel is that's supposed to get this, right? But you look at human nature being what it is, and people are going to, go out, they'll steal it. And then what they'll do is they'll go out and establish a black market to it and say, listen, we have a supply of it. We can give you a shot. We'll take care of you and we'll charge you, $5,000 or whatever. Right. And they're making the money on that. And then if you look at human nature and, there's consistency in the behaviors, what they'll wind up doing is, all right, look, we can't steal it. Maybe it's a little too difficult and the security might be a little too tight to steal it. So what they'll do is they'll just come up with vials of water and do the same thing and just go in and, all right, we're going to inject you and go out and give people their dose and make the money on it, on that of just injecting them water. So human nature is going to be human nature. Those are the type of things that you hope wouldn't exist. You hope wouldn't happen, right? But inevitably, human nature, man, they never fail to disappoint.
Well, I think there's a relatively famous person named Rudy Giuliani that had a quote that was, hope is not a strategy, right? Maybe do you think there's some lessons to be learned here from all of the uproar that's going on now over the mail-in voting and the tracking of who did vote, how many times? Were they alive when they voted? Right? There's going to be some similarities here to the distribution of the vaccine.
Human nature.
Have you gotten it before? Right? Validating that you indeed, are entitled in the first waves of being a first responder or whatever, and we'll get into the logistics of that. But there's going to be some wackadoodles out there that are going to go try and really immunize themselves by getting, 3 and 4, rounds of this thing. Not only to protect those that really do need it, but we need to ward off against the vaccines being stolen. We need to ward off against fake vaccines. We need to ward off against people, hoarding them. It does require a level of discipline here, and like I say, I think there are some similarities to what we're going on, lessons learned here from this recent election.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to equate the two of them, I mean, obviously, the first thing that pops out is we can't figure out how to hold an election. And this is, politics aside, right? Regardless of what side you're on, it's embarrassing to the fact that we cannot hold an election that has it's standardized across the country, that has an air of legitimacy to it, right? We shouldn't be this far down in an election and still having these questions coming up about how many people voted and, the people that were dead and what did they do? And can you verify signatures? No, you can't. In some places you can, some places you can't, right? Think about that. We can't hold something as simple as an election and get that straight to figure out how many people we got. How do you do a distribution on something like this, where you need to be able to track the number of people? Now, simplicity says, simple, you fingerprint everybody. And can you only imagine the public outroar that comes out of that? With, now Big Brother's got my fingerprints. Big Brother is going to inject me with something that, is going to be, mean and cruel and nasty and, potentially, can harm me downrange. So, yeah, when you can equate the two of them. And I think with all of the lunacy that we saw in the elections is the same type of lunacy we're going to wind up seeing here. Clearly, you hope that, cooler heads prevail and that people do the right thing. But in 40-something years of doing this, you could never bet on the public doing the right thing. There's always some idiot that's going to step up.
That's right. You have to anticipate all the stupid potentials and ward off against it, because there's going to be liabilities associated with this as well. And, for somebody that might, like you say, be mentally challenged and is going out there and figures, I'm going to take one of every vaccine that's out there. Maybe I'll take 2 or 3. And then they go and get sick from it, maybe. And then they're looking then they're looking for who's responsible. So the best way to ward off against that is to have good controls, one man, one dose, and just like one man, one vote, right? And
what a novel concept. One man, one vote. Wow.
Or woman.
Or woman, yes.
All right. Well, at that note, we've teed up enough controversy here for the next 2 sessions. Just remind everybody that we are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. A little bit more with logistics. Sal, just tell us about push packages. What are they, and how is that relevant now to what we're looking at here for COVID?
When we were talking about, the distribution of the vaccine and the issues that you run into, we looked at in the earlier time when we were looking at terrorism and we were looking at issues like, chemical and biological terrorism and working on the planning for it. The government had set up, the feds had set up this system with what was called push packages, where you had these crates of just medical supplies, medical equipment, looking at medications, things that you might need. And so that if you did have a biological outbreak, that you could actually deploy this, and it was in support of the medical facilities. So it would have, ventilators and things along those lines, and antidiarrheals and pills. And when we looked at all of that, we started looking at what were the problems that we were going to have. And we recognized that it had this intrinsic value that makes it a target. And so we started breaking down. We actually did exercises with it where we actually brought in a simulated package and we broke it down and said, okay, how do you distribute it? And what we used for the medication was M&Ms. And we realized how flawed the system was because we had boxes and boxes of M&Ms. And you realize that if you had to distribute this out to the public, you had to do it according to a prescription. So it would be 3 pills a day, 7 days, you needed 21 pills. And at one point, it became so comical. One of the guys who was doing it looks at us and hands us some money, and he says, do us a favor, run down to the supermarket, go buy some baggies. And we went, baggies? And he goes, yeah, little sandwich bags. And we goes, for what? And he goes, well, we got to distribute we got to make up the packages for the prescriptions. And we just started laughing. And we realized that it was a great idea. You take all of this and you drop it off and you bring it to a location and you go, here you go. And, you solved. And everybody, wow, hey, it is great. And then you realize, man, this is, when you get into the logistics of it, these are the problems that you're going to run into. And we're going to see those same type of issues when you're looking at the distribution of this.
Right. And then the classification of who's going to be first in line. I mean, it's easy to use the term essential workers, but when you really dive into that, what does that really mean? It's easy to initially say, okay, the medical professionals, the doctors and nurses that are in the hospitals, that are working with the patients. But when you broaden that out to the term essential workers, it's just dominoes that just keep going and going and going because who's to say, who is or isn't, an essential worker because you have classes of employees and workers that are needed to support others. And if they're not there, then the ones that you're trying to make sure are properly equipped aren't able to be effective because they're dependent on other people that haven't been classified as essential workers. And then, of course, you get into the political division then of people that are fronted by saying, what do you mean I'm not an essential worker?
They're already lining up, we're an underserved community and we need to ensure that the underserved community is served first. Yeah, okay. And then who serves that community if you don't get to the essential workers? And, it was eerily reminiscent. Sitting around the table when we were doing the planning was eerily reminiscent of the Abbott and Costello routine on who's on first, right? Because it was that going around and around in circles, right? You look at who the essential workers. So everybody says, well, come on, it's simple. Cops, firemen, EMS, doctors, nurses, hospital workers. That's important. They're essential workers. Okay, that's fine. And you go, who else? And you start looking at other situations that we've experienced that we had done planning for, and we realized that, with a hurricane, Sandy was probably one of the greatest examples. You look at Sandy comes in and wipes out a region, and again, Sandy hit a region it wasn't global, right? We're looking at something here that has global implications, so everything gets grown exponentially. But Sandy comes in, and what do we wind up finding? We find that, well, we had a problem with there was no power. So as a result of no power, gas stations were shut down. Because at the time, there was a law in New York that said that gas stations couldn't have generators. So when they lost the power, we lost the gas stations. When you lose the gas stations, and we couldn't get people to come into work to do repairs because they didn't have fuel for the vehicles, right? So you start realizing, okay, well, these are like critical workers, right? And this is important. You look at COVID, right? You apply what's going on today, and everybody's saying, you have to support and celebrate the fact that supermarkets were able to stay open, that the employees were willing to go to work at the risk of getting COVID to be able to feed a neighborhood. And you go, okay, so clearly you need to be able. You don't want a community starving. You got to be able to support them with food. So you bring in those workers, the store workers, are critical. And then you go to the second step, and you go, well, wait a second. If you work, I do this thing called the stop technique, and there you go, stop, go back. So we jump to that point of the store workers are there and they're selling food. That's all great, but stop, go back. How does the food get to the store? And you go, ooh, well, we need truck drivers to be able to bring it. Okay, now the truck drivers become essential workers. And you go, okay, so the truck driver is going to drive their trucks. They're going to bring the goods. They're going to get to the store. We're going to sell it. That's great. Stop, go back. How does the truck get there? Well, on gas. Well, gas stations now become important, essential workers, right? Because you got to have the fuel supplied so that the vehicle could run, that they can provide the supplies, that you can supply the neighborhoods with food, right? They become essential. And then you got the at-risk populations that, we got to take care of them and ensure that they're okay, right? And then you start working it through, and without getting into incredible minutia with it, at the end of the day, who's not necessary, who's not essential? And worse, when you talk about the politics of it, name one politician that's got a set of balls that can get up and say, you're not essential. It would be the shortest lived political career in the history of politics.
Yeah, well, they seem to be doing that pretty good with the owners of restaurants and barbershops and things like that. I guess they've been the ones that take the brunt of this at this point. Let's switch over then to the logistics then on securing the shipments. What are sling loads, and talk about all the distribution points that we have to deal with to get this kind of volume of a product out there?
So you start looking at how do you effectively get this in, and if you recognize that there's an intrinsic value to that load, you start to realize that you need to be able to get it securely, and we're seeing some of that now, right? We're seeing reports that the movement of this coming out where they're starting to do the distribution, they're doing it under some secrecy and, watching the loads and doing, and taking as many precautions as possible. So they're actually doing it. But when you start thinking about what's the effective way of getting it, you don't want to necessarily drive it the entire time. So, what you'd wind up doing is either getting it on a plane or, in some of the cases when we were looking at, back in the day with the push packages and trying to get out to as many distribution points as quickly as possible and as safely as possible, one of the thoughts was you actually hang it off a sling off of a helicopter and you let the helicopter deliver it to the different locations. And it was one of the methodologies that we were looking at in how we would get stuff around, a geographic area. But in situations like this, again, now you're talking about a global reach, and that the tracking and the maintaining of what went where becomes an incredible task.
Well, not only tracking what went where to ensure that you're getting the proper and fair distribution out there to the essential workers, we're also going to need to be tracking any abnormal reactions to this, because this is being distributed in an emergency use justification. There's been a lot of testing already that's been very positive. The Brits are a couple of weeks ahead of us as far as getting it out to the general population. There's been news of a couple of allergic reactions. Initially, I guess everybody's really looking hard to see if there really is anything that wasn't caught. in the early trials, but we're going to be needing domestically also to do that. And all the more reason why, in the first segment, we talked about making sure that we don't have, fake vaccines that are being distributed and mistakenly taken for real, and people still getting sick, or people taking multiple, vaccines and then becoming sick as a result of that.
Well,
and that being misconstrued as being a fault of the vaccine's efficacy.
Well, what you brought up in the earlier conversations when we were in pre-pro with this, and when you brought up the fact of you got to keep it at a certain temperature. What winds up happening if you don't have if it wasn't maintained at that temperature?
And how black and white is it? Does it become linearly less effective, for the amount of time that it's not maintained at that low temperature, or does it go from being 95% effective and then, as if it's been exposed to warmer temperatures, it just becomes water, after that and has no effect? And are there any kind of tracking mechanisms? I use the
Coors can,
the example of the Coors can, with the Blue Mountain on it. If it's at the right temperature, are the containers, so marked so that they have an audit trail as to whether they've been exposed. We don't. I haven't heard, this publicized as to what methodology they're using. We know that we have the refrigeration techniques in the hospitals. We know that they can be transported within dry ice to be able to maintain those temperatures. But how do you really know that the entire chain of custody of the vaccine has been maintained in those environments? And with the rush to get them out, you just would like to have some sort of controls on there that give confidence to the physicians, and to the pharmacies that are going to be distributing that the materials that they have, the vaccines that they have, they are sound, and again, that's going to lead to the trust of the people, and the results will increase the acceptance of the population.
I love the idea of the Coors can. If it's blue if the mountain is blue, it's cold. I like that. I like that. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we want to remind you you're listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and me, Sal Lafreri. We're going to invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media, like our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages. If you're interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event, would like to consult with us, we're going to ask you to go to the webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So let's get into solutions, pharmacies, hospitals. What do you think of a company stepping up like CVS stepping up and saying, we got 40,000 points of distribution that we can use? What do you think on that?
Well, I think that's going to be very helpful. Just like what the administration did is enlisting public-private partnerships to enlist the development and the research of private industry and pharmaceuticals, in developing these many vaccines that we have at this point. It's going to be that helps with the speed of manufacture, but having it manufactured isn't any good, until it gets into your arm. It's still potential energy. It's not kinetic energy. So being able to leverage, the footprint of a lot of these pharmacies, as well as all of the, medical institutions and hospitals and hospital groups that are out there, you're really going to need a lot of points out there to distribute this. And as we learned from the early testing that we were doing for COVID, the few points that we had, that was logistically, a real challenge. You had 2 and 3 hour long lines for people, driving up to try and get tested. So this should be a lot quicker because it's just a matter of getting in and getting the injection. But the logistical control, again, of who gets it, right? Where do you go to get it, right? Or if you're doing it if you're electing where you're going, the coordination of all of that information to check off that, this is how many we've distributed at this point into which regions is going to be very important to then be in parallel tracking where the infections are. Because you want to be able to correlate the number of inoculations that you're doing in a given region and correlate that to the reduction then of infections and hospitalizations. That's truly going to track the efficacy of the vaccine.
So you think about, one of the things that they're saying is that the government is going to mandate that everybody has to, with the two exceptions, being religious and, for medical. And they're saying you have to have it. Again, that's one of those things that it on paper makes wonderful sense, right? And you could take that strong stand and say, yes, you have to take it. How do you track who didn't get it? It's unenforceable, right? Right. You come out and you say, we insist that everybody, it's mandatory, you got to take it. Well, okay, fine. How do you track who didn't take it? And what are you going to do? You're going to go down and grab them and track them down?
Well, there's one way you're going to be able to, by deductive reasoning, find out who didn't take it. Because if you are distributing the vaccines in accordance truly with the need by the essential workers, and then by where are the hotspots, where are the spikes, right? Push the vaccines out to those areas that are having the spikes. And if you're at least tracking how many you're giving in a certain area, and you have a rough estimate of what your population, is in that area, and then you're getting, you're able to still be tracking how many people are testing and coming up positive. That's where you're going to find aberrations and exceptions that don't jive with what ought to be happening. Because if you're really saturating, a spiked area with vaccinations and making those vaccinations, you should see the correlation then of a decrease in infections and in hospitalizations. And if not, that's got to be investigated. You need to understand, why is that happening?
Yeah, I mean, you start thinking about the populations, and so you can associate and assimilate that a certain percentage of the population is going to refuse it. So you understand those that are refusing the vaccination and are claiming, and statistically, I'm sure you can sort that sort of stuff out. But I think the other part of the problem is that you have a population that's moving, which is you're in New York today, you're in New Jersey tomorrow. So you're trying to hit a moving target, for part of it. And then the other side of it is you get those that are afraid to come forward, right? The undocumenteds, right? And even with regards to that, I mean, what do we do? A census every 10 years? And how many people actually, really participate in it? And how many, the big argument that you always hear is, regardless of whether you're illegal or, to use the proper terminology today, undocumented, you still should send in the census so that we know and, we can provide services for it. We don't have a clue how many people are within a given area. Mm-hmm. It's so you run into that, that problem of, we don't know how many people we got. And, it's all of a sudden you start going through the list of, okay, I'm giving these and giving these, giving these, giving these. And it's, who did I miss? And, to some degree, I mean, it's the canary in the coal mine, right? When they start dropping, then you realize, right? And then Darwin's theory takes over.
Well, we already got a bit of a sample of how much we don't know. By some of these, challenges to the election results, where there's counties where 10, 20% more people voted than live there. Supposedly live there, right? So, this is gonna be another example where that lack of finite data is going to challenge the ability of the medical authorities to truly measure the effectiveness of the distribution and of the efficacy of the vaccine.
Yeah, it's really, it's an ongoing problem. And, you would hope that maybe lessons learned from here, we can apply to election results and be able to establish, some forms of understanding or some forms of compliance. And, and it's just something that, we see it every day. And, that when it comes to compliance, it's not something that everybody is good for and wants to do it. And I think, one of the big problems that we're going to see as a result of all of this is the liability for these companies. You look at some of the legislation that's being put forth now and the stimulus packages and what they're trying to put forth. The companies are going to need to have an immunity, right? There's got to be a hold harmless to it because you can't have a company like CVS or any of the other, Walgreens or whoever the other companies are that are stepping up on the distribution to wind up coming back and getting sued.
Right.
Or, at a more definitive level, if you get it to the corporations, there's talks about major corporations having, their own hospital setups or, their own urgent care centers, right? Airlines do this quite often. And so their staff, their personnel can, if they're not feeling well or whatever, can go to the e-clinic and, and be seen by a physician or a PA or someone. And so now if they're giving you the injection and all of a sudden something big goes bad, you're asking them to assume a liability. And if you want that 100% compliance, then you're going to need to get them to go out and try and get to as many people as possible. And to be able to do that, you got to give them that immunity.
Well, the reason that the cliche, no good deed goes unpunished, is a cliche is because oftentimes good deeds get punished, right? And you do need that cover. To a degree, it's kind of like what, we deal with in security with the Safety Act protection, right? You want the industrial base, to go out there and be part of this solution. And if they're following the guidelines and the protocol that's set forth by the FDA and by the federal government, there's no reason why they should be hesitant to do that because of the liabilities that may come back and be opportunistically pursued.
It's true.
All righty. That wraps it up for this session. You've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe to this show and to like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We remind you and ask if you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us. Please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.